All right, well, it's good to see everybody who's here tonight. It's good to be with those of you who are joining us online. If you haven't been here yet, we are starting this year's Bible study called Dirty Faith. And the title, although it's a little awkward, is meant to imply that idea that as those that are walking in the way of Jesus Christ, we're meant to put our faith into action. That often involves first understanding what we believe and why, and then what it even means to put it into action. So last week when we were here, one of the things we did was talk about, as we go forward, there'll be a number of handouts we'll give you. I'm going to ask you to hold on to those. Is there anybody here tonight? The handout we're using tonight is still the end of last week. So is there anybody who didn't get the handout last week? If you just give me a raise of your hands. Okay, online, just so you know, the handout is actually under a group called Dirty Faith on our app. If you're not connected to our app and you're listening from somewhere else, if you care to email into the church just through the website and let us know, we certainly can get you some directions how to get the access to that. If you're already part of our app community, you can just go to the group called Dirty Faith, and everything we're doing here in terms of handouts is able to be accessed there. And so last week we posted this outline as a PDF, and today we're simply just going to go back to the last page, which we did not get to last week. There'll be other handouts to come, but tonight not so much new. If you can just bear with me for a moment if you're online while I help the folks that need handouts here. Thanks, John. The folks that are here, I'm going to give John a few of these as well, and I'll take a few too. These are actually the answers that fill in the rest of the handout. That way we can use ones that are still blank that we didn't use without throwing them away. Andrea? Yeah. How are you? We do have pens up there. Let me grab one for you. Anybody else need? Ladies? Oh, John. I'll let John. Yeah. This is both. These are the answers for last week. Yep. Is there anybody that needs anything to write on? Meaning you want to put your paper on top of something to write, because I can give you one of these to do that with, if you'd like to do that. Okay. Sorry, online. We'll try and make sure we get a jump on this ahead of time next week. We just had a little bit of a technical glitch that took us right up to the time of starting. So carried in with some just housekeeping here right at the beginning. So a couple things, especially since we have several people that are with us that weren't here last time. I'm certainly not going to go back through the whole first week, but just so you know, when you look at the little handouts with the answers, and if you're joining us online and you're not sure what we're talking about, the handouts we use have some fill in the blanks. If you just go in consecutive order right through, you'll be able to fill those answers in. And I'm sure there are some you could guess without even necessarily having an answer sheet. But the answers are on there. I just kind of X'd out a part that included some notes that I referred to last week. That's kind of my handout that I use. So I just kind of X that out so you'd skip right over that in terms of filling things in. But there are a couple things we talked about last week, and here's what they were. We said, first of all, that according to God's word, it seems to allude to the idea that the church is never going to go away, that Jesus Christ has built his church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. With that being said, we also talked about this. Also, what seems to never going to be going away are those who don't believe. So there'll be those that do believe, those that don't believe, and they will both continue to be here. The question is, as followers of Jesus Christ, first understanding what we believe and why, how do we speak well into those folks that don't believe while also exercising in our life, through our words and through our actions, what we do believe? We said that following Jesus Christ is a great privilege, but it's also a great responsibility. And because of that, there's this call upon our lives to be sure that we are going forward and sharing the gospel well, both in word and in our actions and deeds. So if you have the handout with you that we passed out, tonight what I want to ask you to do is just go to the very last page. If you weren't with us last week, the answers I just gave you, you will fill in up to the last page. If you notice on the last page, there's one final answer that's also on that answer sheet that I'll give you right now. But this will take us to where we ended last week. Remember, every episode we've done, or we will do, it'll be online. So if you happen to miss it, or there's something you can't understand and fill something in, it's all back there online. Just call up the previous meeting. You'll be able to walk right through. I mean, you can fast forward or whatever to get to where you think you need to go, and then we'll go from there. But where we ended last time included this. When people ask about our faith, or they think about our faith, one of the things that may come up when we talked about starting at the very beginning was this: why even pay any attention to your God? Why your God at all? Why Christianity? I'm not starting at parsing parts of the Bible or explaining the Bible to them. In the world we live in today that very much lacks a Judeo-Christian foundation that many of you gathered here today grew up with and no longer exists, part of the question is, why even look at your God or what you believe? And tonight I wanted to talk about that from a place that I think is a place we can come from that everybody understands, and it's going to incorporate Scripture, but it's not going to begin there necessarily, although it's going to tie very close to Scripture as we go through it. So if we start at the very top of that last page, here's what it says: why a Christian worldview? Right underneath that it says this: your worldview is the lens through which you look at reality. Everybody sitting here tonight, standing here tonight, everybody online tonight, or whatever time you're looking at this online, you've got a way that you view the world. There's a lens you use to look at, so you determine, best you think, why the world does what it does, how it does what it does, and how it all fits together and where you fit in it. So that lens through which you look at reality impacts every decision and choice that you make, as well as your values and spiritual commitments, or your lack of spiritual commitments in your day-to-day living. If we looked at it another way, we could say this: when I have a worldview, I'm saying this is what life is all about, this is who I am, this is what I should spend my time doing. I just ask you to think for a moment, what exactly, when you think of those things, how would you answer those now, even to yourself? This is what life is all about. This is who I am. This is what I should spend my time doing. Now, you may remember when we talked about that last one, something to just be cautious of. What we talked about last time was this: when we talk about the idea of growing in our understanding of God's Word, what it means to us, how we share it with others, we are by no means with any shortage of resources today. We are by no means without multitudes of help for how to do that. But one of the things we talked about last time was this: how exactly are we spending our time? And when we look at that worldview question, this is what I should spend my time doing. One of the things we talked about last week was this: a challenge to all of you, and you online as well, is this: to take a week and write down everything you spend your time on. Day by day, moment by moment. Got up, here's the time it took me in the bathroom to get ready. Went and ate breakfast, here's the time that I used when I was eating breakfast. Watch TV, here's the time I used to watch TV. Communicated on Facebook, here's the time I was on Facebook or other social media. And what we said is this: as you do that, and then you go back and look at that, one of the things you may be surprised about is just how much time you spend in ways that ultimately don't have a lot of value that they add to your life. For example, we've already covered this at other times. You can get caught up in social media, even checking like with family on Facebook, and the next thing you know, this post takes you to this post like it's supposed to do, so you keep staying there and it takes you to this post. And next thing you know, 2 hours have gone by. You say, when am I going to find my time to pray? When am I going to find any time to look at God's Word and what that means to me? And we have time that we lose the value of. So, thank you. Is that what I need already? So what exactly is it that we do with that time? Now, as you think about it, thank you. As you think about what we do with the time, think about how much of that time goes by that we could be spending doing something, just trying to better understand who we are according to God's Word, what His Word says life is all about, what it is we're to do as we live day to day. Now, I know we often know that in general, but here's where we get a little stuck at times. We get very bad at sharing it with others because we don't have a sequential knowledge, or we don't have a connect the dots that we can literally share with others and even live out well in our own lives at times. So that doesn't mean we're not followers of Jesus. It doesn't mean we're not saved through God's grace in Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean any of that. But it means in terms of exercising that responsibility to be God's ambassadors. And many times we can fall well short, partly because we do this at times. You know what? I don't know enough to do that. Common response of, I bet you over 50% of those that follow Jesus, I don't know enough to do that. Somebody else needs to do that. Yet you operate in your sphere of influence, your family, those around you that have grown to trust you and have a relationship with you. And because of that, there's this missed opportunity to share about the Word of God, who Jesus is, what He means, and how this worldview that people have that is not Christian, really it's so much less, so less incoherent than what it means to be a Christian. So when we think about that Christian worldview, I'm going to ask you to consider 4 areas, not original with me. Origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. It's written right on your handout already. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Again, think about these questions. Where do I come from? What's the meaning of my life while I'm here? Where am I going when all this is over? What's right and wrong? I mean, they're big deal questions. And here's the thing. Everybody that lives in the world has to contend with them. Where do I come from? What's right and what's wrong to do? How do I find meaning in my life or anything? Where am I going when all this is done? Now, the very fact that every individual has to pay attention to those questions is a big deal in terms of making a connection, both for us with those closest to us and even far away. There are 4 questions that everybody has to consider. But as they're considering those, and they go back to that, well, why you're God, and why even look at Christianity? Why look at Jesus? What I'd like to suggest to you is the very first thing you could say to them, and this is going to sound a little weird, science. Science. Everybody knows science generally, and I would begin by this. The answers that science has come up with, that's why you should look at Christianity and the worldview I have. That sounds a little weird, but let me show you something. I ask you to kind of stick with it. You probably won't get every word, but then let's talk about some things science has found out that actually should be even more compelling to draw people towards answering these 4 questions with a Christian worldview.
So I have been really looking forward to today's interview. I've been arguing for a long time that atheists are basically trapped in the 20th century, that their philosophy has become scientifically obsolete. And I just read a terrific book called The Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen C. Meyer. Stephen Meyer directs the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. As a former geophysicist, he's written bestsellers Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design, Signature in the Cell, and his latest is the USA Today bestseller Return of the God Hypothesis, which I read. I just think it's terrific. Steve, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me on. It's a great privilege.
It is. It's a terrific book. It really is. It's rigorous. It's not tendentious. You don't just say what you want to be true. You make your arguments really clearly. I want to talk, before we get into the argument, the subtitle of the book is The Three Discoveries That Have Brought the God Hypothesis Back into Play. And before we get to those three discoveries, the fact that you call it the return of the God hypothesis suggests that there was a time when maybe it made more sense not to hypothesize that God had created the world or that God was at work in the world. Why is that the case?
Yeah, you mentioned that atheism is stuck in the 20th century. I think it's actually stuck in the late 19th century, which is when the worldview known as scientific materialism was really formulated. There were, the great scientific materialists were Darwin, who told us where we came from, Marx, who gave us a utopian vision of where we were going, Freud, who a little bit later told us what to do about the human condition, about human guilt. And between these great materialistic thinkers, all of whom claimed to be basing their ideas on science, a kind of comprehensive worldview was formulated that answered all the great questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always addressed. And this became kind of the default way of thinking through much of the 20th century among elite intellectuals. And it had, I think, some tragic consequences, because it was also the mode of thinking that underlay the great totalitarian regimes of the 20th century as well. Both Marxism and National Socialism derived tremendous amount of support from basically materialistic assumptions, in some cases even directly going back to Darwinian thinking. So the title Return of the God Hypothesis invites a kind of story, obviously, because to say that it's returning was to say that the God hypothesis as the framework for doing science was lost, but that implies that previous to that, it was also the dominant way of thinking about the natural world, as indeed it was during the period that historians call the scientific revolution.
Yeah, the scientific revolution, you make this argument very clearly in the book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, that it's really inspired in some way by specifically Christian thought. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I think so, and also Judeo-Christian thought, because during the period of the scientific revolution, and that's dated variously by historians of science between, say, 1500 and 1700 or 1750, some go back and see very strong influences that gave rise to modern science in the late medieval period as well, going back as far as 1300 or so, in the great universities like University of Paris and Oxford. But during this period of late medieval Catholic thought and the period of the Reformation, Christian thinkers were rediscovering the Hebrew Bible. And there were a number of concepts that were implicit in the biblical worldview that were friendly to the rise of science. The biggest one was the idea of intelligibility, the idea that nature could be understood by the human mind, because it expressed a rationality that was the product of the divine mind, and that same divine creator who had built rationality and design and order into nature had also designed our minds in a way that allowed us to understand that order and design. And so there was a principle of correspondence between the reason that was built into nature and the reason within us.
And it kind of goes beyond the Greek idea of reason too, because there's a certain, I don't know, I don't want to call it randomness, but freedom in God's work. I mean, he can do whatever he wants, so it's up to us to go out and look at it.
That was a huge concept. The historians of science call that contingency, the idea that nature has an order that's built into it, but it's an order that's contingent upon the will of the creator. It could have been otherwise, just as there are many different ways to make a timepiece or a clock, all of which would require a kind of orderly arrangement of the gears and parts that make timekeeping possible. There are many different ways that God could have ordered the universe, and it's up to us not to deduce that order from some first principles or from some intuitions that we have about how nature ought to be, but rather it's important to go out and look and see how nature actually is. The Greeks were inclined to a kind of armchair philosophizing about nature, and during the period of the scientific revolution, because of this idea of the radical contingency of nature upon the will of God, this was a consequence of the recovery of the doctrine of creation. Nature is orderly, but it's orderly because God chose to make it a certain way. And Robert Boyle put it very succinctly. He said, it's not the job of the natural philosopher, which was what people called scientists at the time, to deduce what God must have done, but instead it's the job of the scientist to go out and look and see what God actually did do. So in addition to having a confidence that there's an intelligibility in nature, there was also the idea that, that nature needed to be studied in an empirical way. We needed to investigate it by looking and seeing and measuring, and this gave rise to an empirical form of science rather than deductive, as I mentioned, armchair philosophizing, which characterized a lot of Greek thought.
So let's talk about these three discoveries that kind of, I mean, it feels like it might have been natural after Newton to just assume that a clockwork universe was going to unfold that was just very easy to understand. But in fact, things turned out to be a little weirder than that. And one of the first things you talk about is the idea of a Big Bang, which really does make things complicated. Can you describe, first of all, where did that idea come from, and why does it make things complicated for scientific materialists?
Well, there's a Princeton physicist from the 1960s, Robert Dicke, who said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. And coming out of the late 19th century, physicists assumed that the universe was infinitely old, that it was essentially eternal and self-existent and self-organizing. And so that made possible this great materialistic synthesis at the end of the 19th century. We could explain the origin of everything all the way back to the elementary particles, and the elementary particles and energy had been here from eternity past. And so matter and energy were essentially had godlike powers. They were the eternal self-existent thing that replaced the idea of an eternal self-existent creator in Christianity and Judaism. So the surprising, shocking discovery of the early 20th century was that, in fact, the material universe, the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy seems, as best we can tell, to have had a beginning. And this was first, the first inklings of this came in the 1920s in observational astronomy, as figures like Edwin Hubble were able to establish that the light coming from distant galaxies was being stretched out as if the distant galaxies were receding away from us. And Hubble's graduate student, Alan Sandage, and others were able to verify that this was the case in all quadrants of the night sky. And the picture that emerged from this was of an expanding universe outward from a kind of starting point, a beginning. And this was a kind of shocking discovery because everyone expected that the universe was eternal and self-existent. Einstein didn't like it at first, though his own theory of gravity called general relativity implied the same thing. He later did come around, though, when confronted with the evidence.
And then you have this idea, I think you call it the Goldilocks universe. Is that your term for it? That it's not just that it starts, but it starts with some really amazing coincidences wrapped into its very organization.
Yeah, physicists call this the fine-tuning, and some physicists refer to our universe now as a Goldilocks universe. The basic parameters of the universe, the force that drives the expansion, the force of gravity, the force of electromagnetism, the underlying strong and weak nuclear forces, the masses of the elementary particles, the speed of light, many basic physical parameters fall within very narrow tolerances, such that if they were a little bit different, a little bit stronger or weaker or heavier or lighter, the universe would not be conducive to life. And the probabilities associated with these individual parameters, let alone the whole ensemble, are incredibly tiny. And yet there's no underlying physical reason, theoretical or physical reason, as to why these parameters should have the precise values that they do. And this is known to physicists now as the problem of the fine-tuning. Many physicists, including Sir Fred Hoyle, who was initially a big skeptic of the Big Bang because of his atheism, came around to theism himself because of fine-tuning parameters that he discovered associated with the necessary abundance of carbon in the universe, which is necessary to life. And he was later quoted as saying that a common sense interpretation of the evidence suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. So in order to make life possible. So this fine-tuning suggested a fine-tuner. There have been contrary hypotheses, such as the multiverse that's being floated now and sometimes makes it into popular movies. But one thing that's not commonly known about the multiverse, and that's just the idea that there are gabillions of other universes out there, such that somewhere, some universe would get lucky and have those improbable parameters. Problem is, all the mechanisms that physicists have proposed to explain where these other universes have come from have themselves required prior unexplained fine-tuning, taking us right back to where we started. So the multiverse actually doesn't explain the fine-tuning, and fine-tuning in our experience, whether we're talking about Swiss watches or internal combustion engines or sections of digital code, is always an indicator of intelligence or the activity of mind.
It's funny, these guys who are constantly citing Occam's razor to say that things should be simple, make this argument of the multiverse, which is kind of like saying this just happens to be the card game in which I drew 4 aces in a, 7 times in a row. I mean, it seems a very complex way of thinking about things as opposed to just saying, well, maybe there's a creator.
It's very convoluted, and more convoluted than I can describe in a short interview, because there are 2 different systems of theoretical physics that have to be invoked to explain the phenomena that a single postulate of a transcendent intelligence can explain. You have to posit all these different universes, as well as all these different theoretical entities like multi-dimensions of space, strings, inflaton fields, in order to explain the one thing that a single hypothesis of a transcendent creator explains very simply. So it's not a parsimonious or simple explanation, the multiverse.
The final of the 3 discoveries is this idea. It's kind of interesting because one of the guys who's supposed to be the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of the new atheists is Richard Dawkins, an excellent writer, obviously a brilliant man, and it's all about evolution for him, and evolution explains so much of where life comes from. But the idea of a code, of a genetic code that creates intelligence has caused some computer scientists to say that absolute Darwinian evolution can't be right. Is that a fair way to put it? Am I getting
absolutely. I mean, and this is the huge discovery of late 20th century science and biology, and that is that the foundation of life and even the simplest living cells, we find an exquisite realm of digital nanotechnology. It started with Watson and Crick in 1953 when they elucidated the double helix structure of the DNA. 5 years later, Crick formulated something he called the sequence hypothesis, in which he suggested that the chemical subunits along the interior of the DNA molecule are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or the zeros and ones in a machine code or digital software that we would work with today. Richard Dawkins himself has acknowledged that DNA functions like a machine code. Bill Gates says it's like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a highly suggestive remark, because we know from experience that software comes from programmers, and that information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, always comes from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or in a computer code. Information is the product of mind. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life, and even the simplest living cell, I've argued, is a powerful indicator of a designing intelligence playing a role in the origin and history of life.
I have a question that I'd like to ask about quantum physics. I'm glad, since I have you here, I'll take advantage of the
Let's take a walk on the wild side.
You touch on this in the later chapters of the book, but it's not one of your 3 discoveries. But the idea in there is this idea in quantum physics that things are defined by our perception of them to some degree, so that we can't tell the location and velocity of something before it is observed, and once it's observed, it maintains that position. We can't tell whether light is a wave or a particle until it's observed, and then once it's observed, it remains a wave or a particle, it seems. That sort of implies to me that consciousness comes before matter, that the words in the Bible that the earth was without form or was void and without form, and God said, let there be light, could almost be literally true, that there has to be some consciousness before there can be some element there. Is that
yeah,
completely
many
wrong?
philosophers have actually, I think it's a very profound insight. My colleague George Gilder says at the heart of matter lies a mystery, and we don't perceive matter without a perceiver. And one of the reasons I brought up the quantum mechanics in this book was that there is a model of the origin of the universe known as quantum cosmology, which attempts to appropriate the mathematics of quantum physics to explain how you can get a universe from literally nothing physical. But the problem with the appropriation of that mathematics is that it presupposes a mathematical structure to the universe before there's any matter. But mathematics is something, as one of the proponents of this idea has acknowledged, mathematics is conceptual. It only exists in minds. So the attempt to explain the origin of the universe apart from the mind of God using quantum mechanics has actually brought people back full circle to the need for a pre-existing mind, the very insight that you've just shared.
Oh, good. I'm glad I wasn't just making that up, because obviously I do not understand. I don't pretend to understand quantum mechanics, but it seems like that to me. You have this remarkable quote from Thomas.
Oh, yeah, I was just interrupting with a little bit, but there's a terrific quote from Hawking about this very problem. He was one of the inventors of this quantum cosmology idea. But in a moment of candor, he says, what puts fire in the equations that gives them a universe to describe? Math by itself is causally inert. It's only something that exists in a mind. We use math to structure things, to design things. But the whole attempt, it's really an ironic story, because the evidence we have for the beginning of the universe seems to imply a cause that transcends matter, space, time, and energy. Before the beginning of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. And in virtue of that, scientists have looked for some alternative to the God hypothesis. They've come up with this quantum cosmological model, but it too implies a prior, unexplained mental reality that is not material in order to explain the origin of the universe. So they come right back, I think, to the God hypothesis in the attempt to avoid it.
Yeah, this brings me back to this really remarkable quote from Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher who wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos and made a big splash, called Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Got attacked by all kinds of people. But you quote Nagel. Nagel does not believe in God, and he came up with an alternative hypothesis to that. But he said, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't right just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. I was really struck by that, because I felt that way about some of the things that Stephen Hawking used to say, that he was committed to this idea that there wasn't a God, that he was as committed as some religious people who know nothing but just what they believe. Why is that? Why aren't scientists open to what seems to me such a simple explanation of the world as we actually know it scientifically?
There's so many different things to say about that, Andrew. First of all, Nagel's candor is just so refreshing, and he went out on a limb to write some very nice things about some of the books advancing the theory of intelligent design, though he couldn't quite go that far himself. He was an atheist who was sort of experiencing cognitive dissonance, understanding that neo-Darwinism and materialistic ideas did not account for the really fundamental one of the fundamental things about our existence, which is the reality of consciousness, the reality of minds. We have them, so we know mind exists, and if you can't account for that, you have a worldview that is inadequate. I think that part of the answer to the why are scientists so wedded, or many scientists so wedded to atheism, I think it's partly a kind of default way of thinking that we've inherited from the 19th century, and there's a sort of groupthink phenomena that is involved in any community of scholars or thinkers, but also I think there's a natural human resistance to the God hypothesis. On the one hand, we would like God to exist because we want to think about the possibility of a life after this life, about significance. We don't want to think of ourselves as cosmic accidents. So we have a motivation to consider the God hypothesis. But none of us also, I think, instinctively like the accountability that comes with thinking about a transcendent intelligence who made us to function best in a certain way, and that therefore there's a moral law, and we may not be on the right side of that all the time. So there's a push-pull, I think, in every human being about whether we want or don't want God to exist. What I tried to do in the book was to extricate ourselves from those motivational questions and issues and just look at what the evidence says. And Dawkins is so helpful because he has this tremendous quote. He's great at framing issues, even though I disagree with his atheism, but he says, the universe has exactly the properties we should expect. If at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, materialism. And what I tried to show in the book is that there have been 3 major discoveries about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. They're precisely what you wouldn't expect if scientific materialism or scientific atheism were true. The universe had a beginning. It's been finely tuned from the beginning for life. And since the beginning, there have been big infusions or bursts of digital information technology in our in our biosphere that suggests a master programmer has been at work in life. None of these things were expected on the scientific atheist view of the late 19th century, and that's the view that we've inherited that's dominated the 20th.
So I know there's some things in there are words you didn't necessarily get, but there's some things that we can summarize and talk about that let me come back to, because there's some things I hope you really got and they were repeated again and again. So the reason I put that up there is in talking to people who don't necessarily even see why they should bother with the Christian worldview. It can really take them aback when you say, well, listen, one of the reasons I think you should is because of some of the answers science has found. The other reason is because of some of the answers science hasn't found. Let me show you one quick other video and then we'll talk through everything.
The hardest question any of us face is not the question of science and God, it's the question of suffering and God. Now, that's not our topic tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but you wanted me to say something briefly about it, do you?
Can we get some more volume,
America
George?
frequently, and it's the question that comes up most often. We're faced with awful questions in our contemporary world. And the problem is that when you ask it, when it gets into the room, you realize, first of all, that there are 2 kinds of suffering. There's moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. And there's pain, cancers, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on, that we don't immediately blame other people on. And then there are 2 perspectives. There's well, let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology than it does the young woman of 25 with 3 children who's just been told she's 6 months to live. And when this question comes up, there's an intellectual side and there's a pastoral side. And you've got to be aware of both. So very, very briefly, and this is hopelessly inadequate. So what I'm going to say now is this. I have a website, johnlennox.org. But if you Google my name in New Zealand, I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And I had to change every lecture, every TV interview, every radio interview. Earthquake, why? And somebody has put them all together and they're still there. And if you want to hear what I say in detail, but very briefly, it's this. I understand people have become atheists because of suffering. I've been to Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. What do you say? But the atheist route has problems. Because if you say, well, that's just how the world is, Richard Dawkins does this. The world's just what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's his view. But half a minute, if there's no good and no evil, why are you talking about the problem of evil and pain? Where do you get the concept of good and evil from if you deny the existence of God? And I want to go down that route because I spent a lot of time in Russia. And for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky was almost a prophet. When he pointed out, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave well. Of course they can. I believe that all men and women are made in the image of God as moral beings, and of course they can behave. What he meant was there's no rational justification for morality if there's no God. Just as I believe, and I've explained to you tonight, why I think there's no rational justification for science if there's no God. This is a parallel thing. So the atheist view has huge problems. And of course, what does it solve? The one thing it doesn't solve is the pain or the evil, still there. So what do we do? Well, let me tell you very briefly what I do. We've all asked the question, surely if there's a good God who's all-powerful, there'd be no evil. So he can't be good or he can't be powerful. You've all heard that, haven't you? And you've all spent hours like I did as a student going through the night. Surely a good God would, could, might, should, all this kind of thing. Have any of you ever come to a satisfactory conclusion after that? No. Not one. I've never met one. Do you know why? It's very simple to see why. Because when we finish the discussion, we're faced with beauty and barbed wire in our world. Or beauty and bombs. It's a mixed picture. That's our problem. And any explanations that don't face that just don't wash. They don't work. So how do we cope with beauty and bombs? That's putting it very bluntly. But you know, if we don't face these things, we can't solve the problem of if God was this and this and this and this, then surely he would. The fact is, we got beauty and bombs. I'm a pure mathematician, and one of the few things I've learned from that is, if you can't solve one question, change the question. So here's my question. Granted that it's beauty and bombs, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there's a God that you could trust with it? Now that's a big question, ladies and gentlemen. I believe there is. See, at the heart of Christianity is not only a resurrection, but a cross. Now come with me. You might find this difficult, but I often say to audiences, look, at least listen to what Christianity says before you reject it. Like I listen and spent my life listening to atheists and Hindus and so on and so forth, arguing their case. At least listen. The claim is that the man on the cross was God incarnate. That's a colossal claim. But come with me. If he was, it raises a very deep question. What's God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, and I've often sat beside people who are suffering intensely, and some of you may be right now, and said at least that tells us that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window, but it opens. Because if that were the end of the story, there'd be nothing more to be said. But the resurrection now tells us that death is not the end. And when the early Christian apostles went out into the world and preached the resurrection, one of the main points they made was, it guarantees there's going to be a final judgment. That's a marvelous thing. Justice will be done. The women and children that screamed their way into eternity in Auschwitz. Does God know about that? Of course he does. Well, this is a huge issue, and I almost hesitate to compress it like this. But ladies and gentlemen, the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ now become a huge focus for something absolutely colossal. Not only does the cross mean that God has drawn near to us in our suffering, it's much deeper than that. If Christianity is true, Christ took upon himself all those things that cause suffering. All the mess that I've made in my life that's caused other people to suffer. And sometimes I thought it was wonderful. My snide remarks, my hate, my jealousy, and all this kind of stuff. He's taken them upon himself so that he can forgive me. Science has nothing to say about love. It's nothing to say about forgiveness. But the biggest thing that I need as a human being is forgiveness. Is there forgiveness? Human guilt is one of the biggest problems in the universe. Now, as I say, this isn't our topic for tonight, but you did ask me to say something about it. And what I would leave you with this, I do not know of any window into this hard question that bypasses the cross. But what I do know is that millions of people have stood at that cross, and by trusting Christ and receiving him into their lives, they've received new life. You know, so often at these meetings in science, people say at the end, and I'm finishing with this, they say, you know, you're a scientist. Aren't you an idiot, really? Because sitting there talking about Christianity, Christianity is not testable. Who told you that? Christianity is testable, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when you watch young people who are dependent on drugs or narcotics, and then you meet them 6 months later and they're free, and you say, what happened to you? Where's the radiance come from? Well, and this is the way they will put it. Well, actually, I found out about Jesus Christ and I trusted him and I've got this new power, and I watched a TV program last Sunday, I think it was, at home. And it was about narcotic dependence and older people, and this house that looked after them, run by Christians. And somebody said, what does this house mean to you? And the man said, do you see that door into the house? I walked through there and I got saved. Saved in the sense of his life saved and made meaningful. Why? Because they told him about Christ. You see, as you see, I'm pretty old. I'm probably pretty near the end of my life. But I have seen again and again and again and again and again transformation in life. And when you see 2 and 2 make 4 thousands of times, you begin to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. What's it got to do with? It's got to do with Christ. That's the evidence. If that wasn't there, I would quit. But it is there. And I've lived with Christ for over 60 years. And in my family and with my wife, we've put it to the test again and again. Now you say that's all subjective, but in the end, the proof of the pudding's in the eating.
So let's unpack a bunch of that, because there are a lot of important things said in there. First of all, why look towards Christianity? Well, because of some of the answers science has given. In that first video, did you catch some of the things said? First of all, there was a time, even because it was promoted through Christianity, that during the time of the scientific revolution, science was a big deal and God was a given. And then that went away. We got into this age of scientific materialism. That's when he talked about Marx and Freud and all of that. And he said, when that came up, what we tried to do is come up with an alternate explanation to explain what we thought we already knew. And what ended up happening is we had some of the greatest travesties occur in the world with some of the regimes that were created. He said from there, we just tried to come up with other ways to avoid what really seemed to be pretty simple, that God is there at the beginning of everything. Today, and I know some of you may be old enough you're not aware of this, but today one of the biggest theories that tries to explain away the fact of God being there is something called the multiverse. And what that means is there are universes like this one, and there are an infinite amount. So, of course, if you have an infinite amount of anything, just if you remember anything from math and probability, chances are one of those things is going to kind of be like a particular way. If you have lots and lots and lots and lots, chances are you can find one that is perfectly like it should be. So, of course, we've got all these universes, and yet you notice a couple things that he said. He said, first of all, no matter which one of those theories you take, you can't get anywhere without there being a mind or thinking to kick it off. You talk about the multiverse, and you've got to do enough mental gymnastics and enough mathematics, and you've got to go around so many circles, and it all comes back to you can't go anywhere with this without a thinking being at the beginning of it. Beginning of it all. And then he says on top of that, there's this. They used to think the universe was just eternal. Matter was God. Then in the 20th century, he found something a little different, which scientists really pushed back against. I know you may think different of this, but they came up with this idea of the Big Bang. It all started somewhere. But who started it? How did it start? You even heard him say during that, well, Albert Einstein, he wasn't so up with that initially, and then he finally came around because his own theories relied upon it. But there's this idea, hey, all of this kicked off somewhere. And it all seems to point to there being a mind behind it. In addition to that, he said, oh, by the way, we also came across this understanding that everything is so finely tuned, it's crazy. And there are a number of things you can look at like that that exist in terms of different things that make this world be like it is and the universe be like it is. If they are even just a little bit off, the axis of the earth and how it rotates, the fact that water can be a liquid, a solid, and a gas at the same time that allows life to go on. All these little things, how close we are to the sun, where the sun is, where the rest of the universe is. There's all this fine-tuning that it just so happens to be correct. But it is also intricately done. How could there not be a mind behind it? And then finally he said this, let's go from the outside to just the inside. He said, oh, by the way, we also found this. Even the simplest cell is so coded, so made like a machine, so filled with nanotechnology. How could we think it just randomly happened? It clearly points to somebody that is behind it all. And so you can be talking to somebody, and I know we can kind of look, and don't get me wrong, first time I watched that video, I know you're getting it cold. I watched it like 4 times before tonight. And I know you're hearing more quantum physics and things like that, and you're like, man, what's this all about? But there are some things that were said in there that one thing I would encourage you not to do as a Christian, don't stop thinking. Sometimes people talk about Christianity being so weak and so shallow is because we're not even able to give answers. You think, well, you just believe or you don't. Folks, that is not going to fly with most people today. There's a time when there's a Judeo-Christian foundation that some of that was a given. Even if you weren't a Christian, there's like the 10 Commandments and all that. I know some of you lived through that. That's not that way at all anymore, at all. It's gone. But to approach somebody and say, why consider your God? Why consider Christianity? Well, let's start with science and let's talk about where all this comes from. Because science tends to think today, based on the evidence they've discovered, it looks like somebody created it all. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, they discovered that it started somewhere. They discovered that it's all so finely tuned. They discovered that even our DNA is so coded in so many ways. How could there not be a creator? Oh, and by the way, all the alternative explanations, they all seem to have to start with a mind behind them all too, no matter how you slice it and dice it. Well, what do you mean? Well, go look it up for yourself. I mean, Stephen Meyer is a legitimate scientist, and they also flashed a bunch of other legitimate scientists. They believe. And the more they discover, the more it takes it right back to where they were originally, that God is at the beginning of all this. Does that make sense? Forget all the quantum physics talk and everything. But that's what he was saying. Do you realize what we've discovered? Science seems to be pointing right back to God being at the beginning of this all. And some of the scientists won't call it God of the Bible, but someone or something made this go. You know, if you can put that before somebody and share that, where do we come from? Hey, how did I get here? Well, here's where it seems like it came from. Now at least you have a way in to begin talking. And with somebody today who's so against Christianity, sometimes that's the way it can take. Don't get me wrong, we're getting into all foundational Christian beliefs, Scripture, breaking it all down. We're going to do all that. But please understand this, there are people today, in a large majority of them, you can't even start there. Because they're going to ask why they should even listen to that. Second video, John Lennox, double PhD, mathematics and physics. He was the sharp dude talking. Notice what he said. What's right and wrong? What's the meaning of my life? Well, if you believe that all of this just randomly happened and it all came about, where do we even get the concept of good and evil? How do we decide what's good, what's evil? If there's no source, if there's no beginning, how do we even come up with a good and an evil? Where do we even get that from? If you read a lot of the comments when people say that, they say, well, we come up with that on our own. We're human beings. I'm an atheist. We're here, and we just come up with good and evil. And of course, we say what's good and we say what's evil. Of course, then there are some places in the world where we say hi to our neighbors. There are some places where they want to eat their neighbors. All joking aside. So which good and which evil? Which continent, which country, which location has the right good, which has the right evil? In Bloomsburg today, what are the people that have the right good and the right bad? See, without that other, he said, without that, where do we even get those concepts? And he says, beyond that, when we look at the meaning of things right now, what on earth do we do with suffering? Because even if you're an atheist, it's there. And it's going to stay there. And he said, Christianity, the very core of that is this cross where this God of the universe, the fourth source, the one that created all, he stepped right into it with us. And he was talking about the beauty and the bombs. He comes into it with us. And he also provides a way for us beyond it. Where are we going? Through Jesus Christ, we're going right beyond the beauty and the bombs. But while we're here in the meantime, we have a God who has stepped into it with us, that he sought to show us, walk this way, don't walk this way, that your life has incredible meaning, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes him would not perish but have everlasting life. I know it was hard to understand, and almost all of it was based on science, although there was some Christianity in the second video. It's a perfect explanation for why Christ and why Christianity. Where we came from God. What am I here for? Ultimately, to help steward this world, to please God, to have a relationship with him through his Son, Jesus Christ. It's broken right now, but it can be restored. Well, what's right and wrong to do? Well, God does a pretty good job of trying to tell us that, although we struggle to do what's right. Where am I going? The God who came in this suffering, also in the resurrection, gives us an opportunity to have new life now and new life forever through him. Every single question answered in a very coherent, corresponding manner. This is why God, this is why Christianity. Anybody want to say anything to there? Rick.
One of the things I teach junior high Sunday school, I talk to them about irreducible complexity.
Mm-hmm.
I say, you're walking in a field, you come up and here's a rock. That rock could have been there forever, you never know where it came from, whatever. But you walk a little further, you pick up a watch, and I hold up my watch. I say, this has got a buckle and a band, it's got hands, minutes, hours, it tells the date. It's complex. It just didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Rock didn't happen there, but it implies a creator. There's intelligence and design, and when you look at that, kind of relate that to your own human body. The complexity cries out that there is a creator.
Amen. Well, and understand one of the keys tonight, everything in what we're discovering about it, even science, which many of us think, oh, science wants nothing to do with Christianity. Even science is discovering that the complexity and everything about it, it seems to point to a creator. No matter how hard people try to hide it. You see at the end, remember the first video he said near the end, why is it scientists don't want to believe? Do you remember the last thing he said? It really applies to many of us. If we considered it, we'd probably prefer it the other way. But what's the big thing about why many human beings don't want to? Absolutely. He said if there's a creator who's created everything and it all has meaning and purpose, and that creator is responsible and he's ultimately the one in charge, then we're accountable. He makes the rules. We're playing in his sandbox. And there's somebody bigger than us, which means it's not just up to us. The good side of that means our life have meaning beyond ourselves, not even determined by this around us. And then we have this opportunity to have a relationship with him. But there's accountability. There are times in your life and mine you want nothing to do with accountability. You've been there, and if you're not, you'll be there soon. I don't want to be accountable in this particular case. I don't want to be accountable here. And yet if there's a creator who kicked it all off, then there's accountability we're called to have. There's a way we're called to live. I'm going to go 2 or 3 minutes over, but for those of you online as well, just to let you know, we were at a meeting last night put on by 4 churches in the area, why abortion is necessary. And 2 of the people, Pam and Rick, in this room were with me. 4 churches, why abortion is necessary. And some of the arguments we were listening to, here's what my concern. We weren't even at the most basic issues. I heard somebody say, well, Christianity is meant to be for the common good, one of the speakers. Okay. Define good. Define common. Define Christianity based on what you're saying. What does that mean, Christianity is for the common good? Well, life's the issue. Which lives? And what does God have to say about that? I mean, I could go on, but you're sitting there in a situation where there's actually clearly these opposite views, these polar views, and let's say you have an opportunity to speak into that, which we didn't get last night, by the way. We didn't get an opportunity. One woman had an opportunity to talk for 3 to 4 minutes and actually refuted the whole, this is necessary healthcare thing. I mean, she really, because she's a practicing physician, she just did a great job of unpacking that in a very nice way. And I think we're pretty good as Christians. Always be prepared to give the hope for the reason you have with gentleness, love, and respect. Where we break down sometime are the reasons. Well, what do I say? We get in a situation like, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to speak back to that. And yet we have this opportunity with all this information we have and to pass on to our kids and our grandkids and others, and even to grow ourselves. These are answers that are there. These are things that can be said. I know you probably wouldn't show those 2 videos, but the reason I showed them is because of the content in them that I kind of synthesized, which answer those questions from science that point back to God. Or where science can't answer those questions, what does science do with love and forgiveness? Nothing. If you look on that last sheet, the very last quote, the scientific method of thought, of logical rationalism, can help us think through our moral beliefs to detect inconsistencies. But you cannot use science to say what is fundamentally right or wrong. You cannot use science to demonstrate that it is wrong to kill or hurt people. That comes from somewhere else. Well, I don't know about you, but those are pretty big things. And that's a quote of Richard Dawkins, who, of course, is an atheist. You heard him brought up there. Well, there are answers for that. And science seems to point back to the Creator that is there. Now, I will tell you, if you're here or if you're online, that was a little bit of the mind-boggling part that's going to happen during this time. That was one of the difficult things in terms of video. From here on out, it should get a little bit easier to follow. But those videos are from YouTube. They're very basic videos. It's amazing and astounding what they say. But I'd encourage you to continue to challenge yourself in your walk. And really, as you come up and look at some of these things, we're going to talk, there'll be another handout next week, and I'm going to go back to the origin, meaning, morality, destiny a little bit. But everything around us seems to be pointing to a Creator, including the science that is so often used against Him. So with that in mind, I just want you, if you get a chance, take a look at these passages before next week. Each area has passages associated with it. I want to talk a little bit about those. There's nothing you have to do with them. You can just read them. I'm not asking you to do anything with them. And then we're going to talk about the end of this handout and use it to launch right into the next one. And then we're going to go back to the Bible itself a little bit. Anybody want to say anything else before we wrap up?
The guy that wrote the Return of God hypothesis, he talked about reason and correspondence. That God made creation and He made us able to understand it. And I like science because every scientific true discovery is kind of looking into the mind of God.
Amen.
And our enemy isn't science.
Amen.
But a lot of times it's scientists.
Mm-hmm.
That debate it. So
Absolutely. But that's a critical distinction. Because I think as followers of Jesus Christ, especially in an age today where science, technology, so much is so prevalent, we think we can't, oh, that has nothing to give us. That's, stay away from that. Actually, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. I'm not sure everybody understands that it actually helps us if we cite what it's found. It doesn't hurt. So, again, I know some smoke coming out of the ears tonight, lots of stuff that was little, like up there in terms of the clouds, a little bit in terms of words being thrown around. But we'll go from there next week. But please understand, part of the reason I did that, for many folks today, you can't start with the Bible, but you can start with that. And that will get you the door into the Bible with them. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks for being with us.